All right, let's get started. Again, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. Today's webinar is called Salesforce User Experience Customizations, Best Practices and Quick Wins. My name is Diana. I'm with CRM Science, and I'm excited to see you all here. We have a lot to cover today, but before we dive in, on the next slide, I'd like to share a little bit more about CRM Science. I'm seeing a lot of new names on the call today, so for those of you who don't really know us or have never heard of us, we are a Salesforce Gold Consulting Partner. We help our clients maximize the value of the Salesforce platform, and we do that by providing end-to-end services on the platform, so anything from strategic consulting to implementations, custom development, and we take it all the way through to user adoption and training. Obviously, today's topic of this webinar, user experience design, plays a huge part in the solutions that we build for our clients. So it's really relevant for us to talk about that today. I also want to make sure that everyone on the call today knows how to stay in the loop of all things related to CRM Science and all of the content that we put together. We present these types of webinars every month. We do a lot of blog posts. We do guides as well. So towards the bottom of this slide, I added some of the social media handles where you can follow us. And it's really the easiest way to stay in the loop of all things that we put out there. So enough about us. Next, I have some very light housekeeping. There are a lot of people on today's webinar, so everyone is muted. We do encourage you to ask questions, and you can use the Q&A functionality in Zoom to do that. And lastly, we are recording this session today, and you will be receiving a link to the replay later today or tomorrow so that you can share it with your coworkers, anyone who could not be here today. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to my coworker, Phil. He is our Salesforce User Experience Designer, and he's going to walk us through best practices and quick wins. Take it away.
Thanks, Diana. Hi, everyone. I'm very excited today to present this webinar around Salesforce customization because this subject is one that I find very interesting. An exciting thing about today's webinar is that it will be very interactive. My last webinar was more of a broad overview, and we just barely scratched the surface of some great UX topics. However, today I have the opportunity to dig a little deeper and even demo some of the things we'll discuss. All right, let's get started with today's agenda. First, we'll get into some best practices by discussing the whys and whens of customization. Then we'll discuss a brand new feature in the Winter 21 update that has a very high impact on UX design. Of course, we'll discuss some quick wins and demo how to actually implement them within your Salesforce org. And as always, we'll save some time at the end for Q&A. I'd like to start with a poll. When Diana and I were talking about what topic we should do for this webinar, I thought about how many times we get the request for some quick UX wins. I think this is because many teams may not have a dedicated UX resource. After all, user experience design is still a very new thing, and UX designer is a very new role within the Salesforce ecosystem. So hopefully Diana can pull that poll up and just answer best you can how frequently your team works with dedicated UX resources.
So everyone should be seeing the poll on their screen right now, and we'll give people a minute or so to answer. All right, we have over 75% of people voted. Going once, going twice. All right. And here are the results.
So it looks like about half aren't sure, and 38%, about a third. Sometimes and 1 vote for always. This webinar was created with those in mind who don't often have the luxury of working with a dedicated UX resource. So there weren't many answers of always or most of the time. So hopefully you walk away today with some great techniques to utilize. Customization helps tell the user story more clearly. And while it's true that consistency is a pillar of good UX design, it's equally true that each user story is unique. There's no one-size-fits-all solution for UX design. Eventually, we're going to need to enhance the UI in a way that requires customization. One of the greatest examples of this that I know of is applying company branding to Salesforce. And this is especially important with external communication, such as a community. I remember one client we developed a community for that wanted to strictly stick to the community template and not have any customization whatsoever. However, inevitably, we were forced to customize some components because it was just not possible to achieve the desired experience without it. And that included applying their branding. So we needed to use customization even though it wasn't part of the original plan. Another good example of this is user guidance, such as tooltips and popovers. As I stated in a previous webinar, a good user experience contributes to better adoption and return on investment. And here at CRM Science, that's a philosophy that we believe strongly. And it's also a main driver behind our UX design. In that webinar, I also discussed the Salesforce Lightning Design System, or SLDS, and how it has many feature-rich components which have great UX out of the box. But even with that robust toolkit, it's not enough to cover every use case. And lastly, customization requires resources. Therefore, we need to know not just why, but when to customize. It's important to focus customizing efforts on those features which will highlight your message. So for example, if you have components that are on the homepage and a lot of users are going to see them, or they take up a lot of screen real estate, those are good candidates for customization. As well as if there are any components that are used by several teams or by the majority of the workforce. It's vital to remember that customization doesn't replace solid functionality. So if a component is unstable or doesn't work, it's not a good candidate for customization. Users are going to see through this facade. They'll be frustrated that the interface doesn't work, and the customization efforts will be for naught. And also, I can't emphasize this enough. Plan out everything. Plan, plan, plan. Include customization in documentation and provide as much detail as possible. We've all been in a meeting where someone says, well, what if we did X, Y, and Z? And that's great, but it needs to be properly documented before development starts. I can already hear someone out there saying, yeah, that's nice to say, but that doesn't always happen. And I get that, especially at smaller companies with less defined processes. But what I say to that is plan for the unplannable, plan for that too, plan for everything. The more we plan, often the more adaptable we are because it gives us a frame of reference. So barely 2 weeks after my blog post went live, one of my colleagues informed me that it was already outdated. So that's just the way it goes in Salesforce, isn't it? Winter 21 will introduce styling hooks, which I'm very excited about because this enhancement allows for styling of base Lightning components, where before workarounds were required to do so. I shared a method in that blog post of how to do that using a static resource CSS. Now I'm glad to have the opportunity to update my blog and demo how to use styling hooks. So that'll be fun. As of now, this feature is in beta until winter 21 goes GA. And it's also important to realize that not all components and classes are supported yet. So here I've provided a link to the Lightning Design System docs. which very conveniently lists all the blueprint components and which ones support styling hooks. There is also global styling in the works, which is very exciting as well. This will allow for styling of entire themes, not just single components. It's good to know that when this feature is introduced, it will be compatible with the current styling hooks, so it won't. It'll work within the code that we developed using these style hooks for individual components now. And at the bottom of this slide, I have a link to the documentation for style hooks. So when these slides are distributed, you can read that. So without further ado, let's jump into our first demo. And I'd like to demo the power of styling hooks. So for this demo, for all of these demos actually in this webinar, I'm going to be using VS Code, and I'm going to be using Salesforce DX. So here I have a Scratch org set up for our demos. And I'd like to just show the finished result, and then we'll go back and look at how to implement that. So here you have some buttons, very common components when it comes to user interface design. And what you might not notice is one of them is an HTML button and one of them is a Lightning button, a Lightning component, base component. So previously, HTML buttons would be able to be styled with local CSS files, but not Lightning component buttons. But now with styling hooks, both can be styled. So let's take a look at how to do that. So here in the Lightning web component that was being shown back over in the org, there's the HTML file. And these are the two sections of the grid. The left was without the CSS class and the right was with it. So if we look here, the only difference that we can see is that these buttons on the right have this orange button class. So if we jump over into the CSS, we'll notice that there is a class set up with the styling hooks on it. So if we just comment that out real quick. And replace it with a standard CSS property. We'll take a look at why this is important. And I'm just going to push that up to our org. Right, nice and quick. So I'll refresh our org here. And you can see that when we just applied normal standard CSS property, only the HTML button got the styling, but the Lightning component did not. So that's why styling hooks are so powerful, because now we can use the Lightning design system and all the great out-of-the-box components it has, but we can also use these styling hooks to add our branding to them without a lot of overhead or workarounds that we had to do previously. So just one more thing about these styling hooks. As you can see, the classes are pretty long. So, you know, I don't have these memorized or anything. I just go to the documentation, I look up which style hooks are supported, and then I just copy and paste those appropriate styles. Great, so let's jump back into our slide deck. For quick win number 2. So for quick win number 2, I want to mention an overlooked aspect of user experience design, which is preloading and error handling. So really, though, the downtime is just as an essential part of the experience as the actual interface. So I think that's a reason why it's usually not. It's usually an afterthought, the preloading of an interface, but it's really equally as important. The best practice is to never ever leave the user guessing. So as you can see in this image on the slide, there's text here directing the user what steps to take next. The rule of thumb is that it should never look the same if something's not working as when there's just an empty state or the component hasn't loaded anything. The great thing about illustrations is that they can fill the negative space and they improve the aesthetics of the design. And another advantage is that you can use a conversational tone, and that can help lighten the impact of missed expectations. So in today's world, users want information quickly. They come into a page, they need to get what they want, and it's very easy to make a good or bad first impression with user experience. So that's why illustrations are a great way to control that. So before I jump into the next demo, I have a quiz for everybody. How does the Lightning Design System documentation suggest that you use illustrations? Is it to use SVG code directly in the HTML, load the illustration in an image tag, use a Lightning illustration tag component, or all of these methods are suggested? And Diana, if you would, oh, yep, she pulled up that poll, so we'll give everyone a chance to answer that. And you'll have to let me know when there's a good amount of results, Diana.
We're about 40% in right now, so I'll give it a few more seconds. All right, so I'm closing out the poll right now, and you should see the results.
Okay, so I'll go through the answers real quick first. There actually is no Lightning illustration tag out of the box anyway. So that also invalidates all of the above, which I think got a lot of people. It was about 50% all of the above. You could do it with either an SVG or an image. But the way that the documentation suggests is SVG markup, which surprisingly there were no answers for that. So it's important to realize that you can do it with an image tag. I'm just, the reason I wanted to ask this was to kind of call out that there are multiple ways to do it, and there are pros and cons to each way. So we'll talk a little bit more about how the documentation suggests to do it, and pros and cons to that in the demo. Right, so let's go to our second quick win, and I'll just show you the end result first here. So as you can see, it's pretty clear the difference in experience. If you were coming into an interface, which one would you want to see? This one has an illustration, looks nice and clean. it tells you what went wrong. There was no accounts that matched the search criteria, as opposed to here we just have an empty table. So I think the difference is clear when you see it side by side. So how do you implement this? Well, actually, let's start out with the documentation, because we have that quiz. So this is the lightningdesignsystem.com. And I'll just search for illustration. And here you can see that they have a whole library, really, of illustrations to use, which is great. And on the right here, they even have them organized by category. So for example, in our org, we have a data table, and there's no data. So I've decided to use the desert illustration for that particular use case. But this is what I mean. So if we click here to show the code, this is how they suggest to do it, which is just copying and pasting all the markup of the SVG into the component. So that's one way to do it. I think a lot of people might have answered the image tag because it's a little bit, it keeps your code a little bit cleaner. So I just wanted to call that out, that there are multiple ways of doing it. This way is nice because if I want to, I can just copy the code here, jump back into VS Code, and just for the sake of this demo, I'm just going to paste it right here at the bottom. All I did was just copy and paste it. If I refresh here, you can see that that's all it really was. All it takes to get an illustration into your component is just copy and paste. But like I mentioned, that's a lot of markup, and it makes your code very messy. So here at CRM Science, we actually developed a custom component to take all the markup from all the different illustrations and put them into separate files so that the code was clean, and also so that you could just use an attribute to tell the component which illustration to load. All right, so quick win number 3 is going to be the use of stencils instead of spinners. The stencils are placeholders that visually communicate content that's in the process of loading. So for more customization, we can use stencils while preloading instead of spinners, which are a lot more common that you'll see. They offer more customization because there isn't a standard component for stencils yet, like there is for spinners. And similar to illustrations, this is another good method to control the aesthetics of downtime. Since there isn't a standard library to draw from, stencil development is more time consuming. So it should be developed iteratively. And what I mean by that is, as you identify situations that allow for stencil development, you can build your own stencil library and then draw from those in the future. Implementing stencils is a simple 2-step process. The first step is to actually create the stencil. This can be done either with code or if you're savvy with software like Adobe Illustrator, they can be drawn and then exported as SVGs or even images, but really an SVG is, you want to stick to an SVG so that it loads quicker. After all, it is a preloader. So once we have the stencil, then the second step is to add the conditional logic to display it. And we do this by adding markup for both states, so preloading and loaded. And then we use the if true template directive to show either of those scenarios. All right, so let's take a look at stencils in our third demo. Okay, so that was very quick. So I added these toggle switches here to simulate the loading so that we can get a better look. So as you can see, it mimics the shape of the data table and it looks really pretty. That's a great user experience. And it provides a more custom look and feel than just a spinner, which you'll see very often because it's only a few lines of code. So here I have two different approaches, much like the illustrations. You can use an SVG for stencils, or you can, for the SVG, you can put the markup directly in the HTML file, or you can load it as a static resource. But with stencils, you can actually create them with code as well. So I want to show that approach. So if you take a look in the code here, you'll see that here's the template directive, if true, init loading. So there's some logic that's being created and assigned to this variable. And you'll also notice that the spinner was layered over top of it. Let me just jump in so you can see that. So it's not only a stencil, but the spinner is on top of it as well. Provides a little bit of animation and has a nice look to it, I think. So the stencil is actually a for loop, and it's a lightning layout, and each row in that loop is just a lightning layout with certain styles applied to it. So this one is being generated with code. It's looping through each row, creating these faux text boxes and fading it out iteratively as it goes down. So the opacity is being reduced. So it's even the style is dynamic and being and changing at runtime. So this method is, if you're more comfortable writing code, and you can get some really great customization with this method because it provides for a lot of different use cases, and once you create the code for it, you can use it in a lot of other places, and it's very scalable. However, you can also just upload an SVG as a static resource. So I'm not going to go into that in this demo, but I do provide a link at the end of this slide deck for how to use static resources. And the stencil was actually just taken from the Lightning design system documentation. So let me show you that real quick. So for this demo, all I've done is just downloaded the stencil here. And you can see that it's being used here. There was some styles to stretch it over the entire length of the card, but for the most part, it's just uploading that as a static resource, and then conditionally showing it as it's being loaded. And then once the load finishes, then we get our data table. All right, so let's do a quick recap. Today we discussed some best practices and quick wins around Salesforce UX customizations. Customization can be expensive, so it should be focused to strategic areas that enhance the user story. Customization is not a valid substitution for functionality. And last but not least, plan and document everything. Today, we also saw a brand new feature, styling hooks, in action. We saw how to enhance the UX even in downtime with illustrations and stencils. And I also discussed multiple approaches at implementation for different skill sets and/or preferences. On this slide, I've included the relevant links from this webinar, as well as an interesting article on creating stencils in LWC and how to access static resources, which we didn't cover. So if you need more information about that, that's right here. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. At this point, I'd like to open it up to some Q&A.
Thanks, Phil. That was great. So everyone, as Phil just mentioned, if you have any questions, now's the time to type them into the Q&A feature in Zoom. Let's see what we have here. Someone is asking, Phil, if there are any other features in Winter 21 with a significant impact for UI customization.
That's a great question. So there is one feature in particular that I think has a big impact on UI design and UX design, and that's rich text input fields now have the ability to create custom buttons in them, and I think there's a lot of great chances to improve the UX there. Let me see if I can just show that real quick, just to give people some text, some context. So this area here is now customizable. So you can create, new buttons to control the styling of the text. You could even make a like an emoji button. That was actually going to be my fourth demo that we didn't get time for, but yeah, I think that's a really cool feature in Winter 21 as well to check out.
Very cool. The next question is, what are some other examples of components that can have branding applied with styling hooks?
So like I mentioned, there aren't a whole lot of not every component is supported yet, but a lot of the common ones are. I showed buttons, but there's also modals and icons. Icons is a very common one, and it required a lot of workarounds before to style icons. So I think that's another one that's going to be really useful for UX design.
All right, and then I see one last question. Can you share some of the pros and cons for implementing stencils as code versus SVG?
Sure. So for stencils, if you want to program them, like I mentioned, you need to be a little bit tech savvy, so you have to have that resource. You have to feel comfortable with code. Whereas if you were going to do the SVG, you could just download the ones that I showed you, or you could have a designer draw them, and then they could be exported as SVGs as well. I personally think that creating them with code is usually the best way to go, because that allows for them to be edited really easily. Once you have, like I showed that table stencil. Once you have a table stencil, then it's really easy to just use that in every time that you want to use a data table. Whereas with an SVG, it might not always look good if it's stretched or scaled. So that's some of the pros and cons there.
Okay. Thanks everyone for these questions. I don't see any more, so I think with that we are ready to wrap up. So if you could go to the next slide, Phil. Thanks so much for joining today, everyone. Like I said, we'll make sure that everyone receives a link to the replay as well as a copy of these slides. Of course, feel free to share them with your coworkers who couldn't be here today. And again, thanks for joining today. We'll see you again next time on the next CRM Science webinar. Thanks so much. Take care.